We are counting down the 25 strange, forgotten meals that poor men ate every single day in America in the 1950s. These are dishes that held families together when paychecks ran out on Wednesday and payday was still 3 days away. From one-pot suppers that turned a ham hock and a handful of dried beans into a feast, to meals so humble they never made it into any cookbook, each entry tells the story of survival in working-class America before the supermarket changed everything. Expect ingredients your children would not recognize, flavors born in coal camp kitchens and sharecropper shacks, and the quiet dignity of men who fed their families on almost nothing. Which forgotten meal tops the list? Let's begin the countdown with number 25. Number 25, fried bologna sandwiches. Before deli counters sold $100 charcuterie boards, the working man's lunch was a thick slice of bologna in a cast iron pan. A pound of bologna cost about 29 cents at the A&P in 1953. Fathers sliced it thick, half an inch or more, scored 4 shallow cuts around the edges so it stayed flat in the pan, and fried it until both sides turned dark and crisp. That scoring trick was passed between neighbors in mill towns from Pittsburgh to Birmingham without ever being written down, slapped onto white bread with yellow mustard. That was lunch, and men ate it without complaint because it was hot, it was filling, and it was theirs. Number 24, cornmeal mush. Long before grits became a brunch staple, poor men across Appalachia started every morning with cornmeal mush. A 5-pound sack cost about 19 cents in 1951. Boil salted water, pour in the meal slowly, stir for 15 minutes. Pour it hot into a bowl with a pat of lard or a splash of sorghum. That was breakfast before a man walked 6 miles to the coal mine. The real trick was pouring leftover mush into a loaf pan overnight. By morning, it set firm, sliced clean, and fried crispy in bacon grease. Men who grew up on it called the fried version better than the original, and they were not wrong. Number 23, crackers and milk. This one surprises people until they hear it explained. A man would fill a tall glass with cold whole milk, crumble in 6 or 7 saltines, and eat the whole thing with a spoon. That was supper. Not a snack. Supper itself. A box of saltines ran about 19 cents in 1954. Milk was 21 cents a quart. For under 40 cents, a man fed himself twice. Some added black pepper. Others stirred in sugar and called it a treat. Oral histories from rural Georgia and eastern Tennessee record this as a nearly nightly supper in working families throughout the 1950s. The men who ate it saved their complaints for other things. Number 22, tomato gravy and biscuits. When there were no meat drippings and no sausage, poor men made tomato gravy. A can of stewed tomatoes cost about 12 cents in 1952. Poured into the skillet with a little flour and the bacon grease always left in the pan, it was stirred until it thickened into a rust-colored gravy that smelled like summer gardens. Ladled over lard biscuits, this was supper 4 nights a week across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. One man from rural Alabama recalled eating tomato gravy and biscuits so often that he did not realize other families ate differently until he joined the Army in 1956 and saw what a mess hall served. Number 21, mulligan stew. The name tells you everything. There is no recipe, because it was built entirely from whatever had not been eaten yet. Water on the stove, whatever vegetables were going soft in the icebox, scraps of meat still clinging to last night's bones, a handful of dried barley if the pantry had any. In the 1950s, this dish carried the legacy of the Depression and the hobo camps of the 1930s, where strangers pooled their last scraps into a communal pot over an open fire. Poor working men kept that spirit alive in rented rooms and thin-walled houses. The stew was never the same twice. Some weeks it was mostly potatoes and onion. Other weeks, a lucky find at the butcher's discount bin added oxtail or neck bones. The smell of it cooking, that vague, savory steam that could have been anything, was the smell of not giving up. Nobody put it in a cookbook. Nobody needed to. You made it with what you had, and you were grateful it was hot. Number 20. Salt pork and field peas. Salt pork was the meat that kept working-class Southern families alive. A slab of salted fatback cost about 18 cents a pound in 1953, and a man could flavor an entire pot of field peas with just a few ounces of it. The peas simmered for 2 hours with the salt pork until the broth turned creamy and the fat had dissolved completely into the liquid. The result was a pot so rich with pork flavor that the actual meat almost did not matter. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet alongside it. Nutritionists in the 1950s dismissed this as poor people's food. Researchers in 2021 found it delivered a protein and mineral profile remarkably suited for sustained physical labor. The men who ate it already knew. Number 19. Chicken necks and rice. Chicken necks sold for a few pennies a pound at butcher counters across the country. 2 pounds went into a pot with water, onion, salt, and pepper and simmered for an hour and a half. They fished out the necks, picked every scrap of meat off by hand, and put the shreds back in the broth. They poured in rice and cooked it until it absorbed everything. The result tasted like something far more expensive than it was. This was Sunday dinner in thousands of poor households in the South throughout the 1950s, a tradition rooted in decades when the best parts of the bird were reserved for someone else. Men who built this country from the inside out ate chicken necks on Sunday and showed up Monday without complaint. Number 18. Pinto bean pie. First, pattern break. This one sounds wrong until you taste it. In Appalachia and the Ozarks, pinto beans were so central to the diet that cooks worked them into every course, including dessert. Pinto bean pie looked exactly like sweet potato pie. It smelled like it. Most people who ate it at church potlucks in the 1950s had no idea what was in it. Mashed, cooked pintos, sugar, 2 eggs, vanilla, cinnamon, and nutmeg were poured into a lard crust and baked until set. The beans turned sweet and dense. The texture matched a custard pie better than you would believe. Pinto beans cost about 10 cents a pound in 1952. A bag produced 2 pies and 3 dinners. The only reason this disappeared is that sweet potatoes got cheap enough that nobody needed the substitution anymore. Number 17. Navy bean soup with ham hock. The United States Senate has served this soup every single day since 1907. But long before it became institutional, Navy bean soup was the most reliable meal a poor man could put on the table for almost nothing. A pound of dried beans cost 15 cents in 1954. A ham hock ran about 25 cents. Together, they made enough soup to feed 6 people for 2 days. Soak the beans overnight, then simmer 3 hours with the hock until the meat fell off in shreds and the beans dissolved into the broth, thickening it on their own without flour. A man ate it for lunch, came home to find it still on the stove, ate it again for dinner, and felt full both times. Number 16. Streak-o-lean with greens. The name describes the cut itself. It is a piece of salt-cured pork fat from the belly, streaked through with a thin vein of lean meat. You did not eat it straight. You rendered it low in a cast-iron pot until the grease pooled out, then dropped in a dishpan full of collard greens, washed 3 times in cold water. The greens cooked down to almost nothing, turning dark and silky in the pot liquor. That liquid at the bottom, men drank from a mug when they felt a cold coming on. Doctors in the 1950s had no interest in that practice. Modern nutritionists have since confirmed that pot liquor from long-cooked greens is dense with folate, calcium, and vitamin K. Number 15. Savory bread pudding. Everyone knows bread pudding as a dessert, but in poor households across the rural South and the industrial Midwest, a savory version appeared at supper that bore no resemblance to the sweet kind. Day-old bread, hardened and torn into pieces, was soaked in beaten eggs, thinned with water, mixed with chopped onion, black pepper, and whatever meat scraps could be found. Packed into a greased pan and baked until set into a firm loaf that sliced clean and held together on the plate. It tasted like stuffing. It functioned like a meatloaf, and it cost almost nothing because the bread had already been paid for and was headed toward the trash. Men ate it without ceremony, cutting slices at the table and eating with ketchup or hot sauce. It asked no questions and made no promises. It was just supper, solid and quiet, the kind that got you through to tomorrow. Number 14. Cracklin bread. This is where poor man's food turned into something restaurants in Nashville charge $20 a slice for. Cracklins are the byproduct of rendering lard on southern farms. Nothing was thrown away. The fried-out pork skin bits were mixed directly into cornbread batter before baking, studding every slice with salty, crunchy nuggets that no amount of butter could improve on. A pound of fatback cost about 20 cents in 1953. The cracklins were free, a bonus that turned basic cornbread into something men talked about at work the next day. Modern chefs call it artisan cornbread with rendered pork lardons. In 1953, a man in Georgia called it breakfast. Number 13. Potatoes fried in lard. Not home fries, not hash browns, just potatoes cut however they came off the knife, fried in lard deep enough to cover them halfway, salted hard, turned once. A 10-pound sack of russets cost 49 cents in 1952. Lard ran about 15 cents a pound and lasted weeks. Poor men across Appalachia, the rural Midwest, and the industrial North ate fried potatoes as a main course more often than any recipe would suggest. The lard gave them a crust that vegetable oil has never replicated. The only reason nobody admits how good this was is that lard stopped being socially acceptable sometime around 1975. Number 12. Dried saltfish and potatoes. Where the railroad brought salted cod packed in wooden crates, dried salt fish was the poor man's protein that required no refrigeration and lasted almost indefinitely in the pantry. Salt cod cost about 18 cents a pound in 1951 and needed 2 days of soaking in cold water before it was edible. After soaking, it flaked apart with a mild, pleasantly briny flavor that bore almost no resemblance to the stiff plank it started as. Boiled with potatoes and onions, or mixed into a hash and fried in bacon grease, it fed working men from Gloucester to New Orleans on a budget that barely registered. Millions of Americans ate this in the 1950s and never talked about it later, because the memory of that soaking water reminded them of times they preferred to forget. Number 11. Neck bones and rice. Third pattern break. This is the meal that built the American working class and got absolutely no credit for it. Pork neck bones sold for 10 cents a pound in 1953. The cut nobody else wanted. Men who knew how to cook understood what those bones contained. Hours of simmering transformed them completely. Collagen dissolved into the broth, turning it thick and glossy. The small pockets of meat between the vertebrae softened and pulled away easily. Cooked with rice, onions, and garlic in the same pot, the rice absorbed the pork-enriched liquid and became dense and deeply flavored. poor black families in the South ate neck bones and rice as the main event. The dish traveled north with the Great Migration, fed families in Chicago tenements and Detroit factory towns, and sustained generations of men building the industrial backbone of mid-century America. Number 10. Hobo beans. The name comes from roadside camps where men warmed canned beans over open fires during the Depression. But in the 1950s, hobo beans evolved into something deliberate, made from scratch in poor working kitchens. Dried pinto beans were soaked overnight, then cooked low and slow for 3 hours with a piece of salt pork, onion, black pepper, and sometimes a spoonful of molasses for sweetness. The beans absorbed the pork fat completely, the broth reducing to a thick gravy that clung rather than ran. A pot cost under 40 cents total and fed a family of 4. It sat on the back burner for 2 days, getting better with every hour. Nothing else in the poor man's kitchen delivered that much sustenance for that little money. Number 9. Souse meat. Here is the one that separates the squeamish from the practical. Souse, called head cheese in the North, was made from pig ears, snout, cheeks, and feet, simmered together for hours until the gelatin released naturally from the cartilage and bones. The cooked meat was shredded and seasoned with vinegar, black pepper, crushed red pepper, and sage, then packed into a loaf pan to set overnight in its own jelly. By morning, it had firmed into a dense, sliceable loaf that held together clean on the knife. It was eaten cold on bread with hot sauce or mustard. A whole souse loaf from the butcher cost about 20 cents in 1953. Some men made their own when a neighbor butchered a hog in November, following the old tradition where nothing from that animal went into the ground. Men who ate this knew exactly what was in it and did not flinch. The vinegar cut through the richness, the pepper gave it heat, and the gelatin made every bite satisfying in a way that lean lunch meat never managed. Number 8. Lard and bread. This one is harder to write about because it requires understanding a level of poverty most Americans today have never touched. In the worst weeks, a man would spread lard on bread and call it supper. White pork fat from a tin, spread on white bread, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a raw slice of onion on top. A tin of lard cost 19 cents. A loaf of white bread cost 16 cents. With those 2 purchases, a man could keep his family fed for 3 or 4 days, if he had to. Oral histories from coal mining communities in West Virginia record this as a near weekly occurrence throughout the 1950s, when the mine shut down or the company's store cut credit. Many men who ate lard and bread as children grew up to organize unions because they remembered exactly what the bottom looked like and had no intention of returning to it. Number 7. Fatback and dried beans. 4th pattern break. This combination was so efficient at sustaining human life on almost no money, it deserves more credit than any diet book has ever given it. 12 cents for a pound of dried black-eyed peas, 5 cents for a quarter pound of fatback. Cooked in one pot with an onion and enough water to cover, they produced a meal nutritionally complete, enough to sustain heavy physical labor, and cheap enough to eat 3 times a week without straining any household budget in America. The fat from the fatback coated every bean, slowing digestion and keeping men full through long physical shifts. The combination produced a flavor that neither ingredient created alone. Men who ate this were not eating it ironically, they were eating it because it worked. Number 6. Cornbread and buttermilk. Every Southern poor man over 70 knows this one. Take a tall glass, crumble last night's cornbread into it until the glass is mostly full, pour cold buttermilk over the top, and eat the whole thing with a spoon. Supper. Buttermilk cost about 10 cents a quart in 1953. The cornbread was already made. Together, they made a cold, tangy, filling meal that required no heat and no preparation. The buttermilk softened the cornbread without making it soggy, and the slight sourness played against the slight sweetness of the corn in a way that was genuinely pleasant, not merely tolerable. Men who ate this on porch steps in July heat were cooling off and filling up in the most efficient way available to them, and the meal was honest and good. Number 5, pickled pig's feet. Large glass jars of pickled pig's feet sat on counters at gas stations and general stores across America throughout the 1950s. A single foot cost about a dime. They were sold individually, wrapped in wax paper, and eaten out of hand. Poor working men stopped on the way home from a shift, bought a pig's foot, and ate it while walking. The pickling brine, sharp with vinegar and red pepper, preserved the cooked feet indefinitely without refrigeration. Gas station owners in Mississippi and Alabama kept the jars full because they sold out. These were not novelty items for brave eaters. They were working-class protein, sold by the piece to men who needed something in their stomach and had a dime in their pocket. Number 4, savory oatmeal. Before oatmeal became the sweet breakfast cereal drowned in brown sugar and fruit, poor men ate it savory. They cooked it thick with salt and nothing else, sometimes stirring in a knob of lard for calories. A cylinder of Quaker oats cost about 23 cents in 1952, and it held enough oats for 14 breakfasts, cooked with water, salted hard, eaten as fuel, thick enough that the spoon held its shape in the bowl. Leftover oatmeal was sliced from the pan after it cooled and set overnight, then fried crisp in lard the next morning, sometimes with a fried egg laid over the top. Nothing left, the kitchen wasted. Number 3, bean soup with a spent bone. When the fat back was all the way gone, what remained was a bone. Not a soup bone from a roast, just the remnant of a piece of fat back used until there was almost nothing left of it. A poor man's wife put that bone in a pot of dried beans anyway. She covered it with water, added an onion cut in half, and cooked it for 3 hours. The bone gave up the last trace of smoke from the curing house, the last echo of the fat that had fed the family all week. The soup was thinner than it would have been with a full piece of meat, but it was not nothing. It was warm, it was seasoned, it tasted like something. A pot of dried navy beans with a spent bone cost under 20 cents in 1954 and fed a family of 5. That math never stopped being true, and the families who relied on it never forgot the arithmetic. That was enough. Number 2, chipped beef on toast. The Army called it something unprintable. Every enlisted man who served between 1940 and 1960 knew exactly what was meant. Chipped beef was dried and salted beef, shaved into paper-thin sheets, sold in small glass jars for about 35 cents. It was soaked briefly in warm water to pull out some of the salt, then cooked into a white sauce of flour, lard, and milk, and served hot over toast. Poor men who made it at home, who controlled the soaking time and the seasoning, who used good milk and enough black pepper, made something that genuinely worked. A glass jar of chipped beef, a cup of milk, a tablespoon of lard, a tablespoon of flour. Under 50 cents. Hot supper on the table for the whole family. Number 1, pinto beans and cornbread. There is no more honest meal on this entire list. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 12 cents in 1953. A bag of cornmeal cost 19 cents for 5 pounds. Together, cooked in one pot and one cast iron pan, they fed a family of 6, with money left over. The beans went into the pot soaking in the morning while the man went to work. His wife started them at noon with a ham hock if there was one, a piece of salt pork if there was not, or plain water with an onion if there was nothing else. By supper, the beans were soft, and the broth had thickened to something almost creamy. The cornbread went into the cast-iron skillet at 5, edges setting and pulling away, rising in the oven while the kitchen filled with that warm, starchy smell. A man crumbled the cornbread directly into the bowl of beans and ate both together with a spoon. Oral histories from every poor corner of this country, from Appalachia to the Mississippi Delta, from the hill country of Texas to the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, record pinto beans and cornbread as the meal that held the floor when everything else fell through. Not because it was special, because it was there, because it was cheap, and it was filling, and it tasted, against all odds, like something worth sitting down for. Men who grew up on this fed their children on it too. Not out of poverty by then, but out of memory. Because it reminded them where they came from and what they could survive. Because the beans and the cornbread together tasted like their mother's kitchen and their father coming through the door with dirty hands and a tired face, sitting down at the table without complaint. That meal built this country from the bottom up. These 25 forgotten meals tell a story no history book has bothered to tell in full. They are the story of men who worked the worst jobs for the worst wages and who fed their families anyway on beans, fatback, cornmeal, and salt. Thrift was not a preference, it was a discipline. Every bone went back in the pot. Every scrap of bread went into batter. Every spent rind was cooked into greens one more time. Some of these meals have returned in different forms. Pinto beans are now sometimes rebranded as artisan heirloom legumes, and crackling bread sells for $9 a slice at Southern Revival restaurants. The men who originally ate these foods would not recognize those price tags, but this list is for them. They knew something about food, patience, and making something from almost nothing that no cooking show has ever managed to teach.